I'm obsessed with this podcast, Normal Gossip, which takes like an average person, sort of everyday gossip stories and like anonymizes it and shares it. And there was definitely one about, I think, a bachelorette party and like the one empath. And that was not the good character, right? Like at the end, when they're talking about who's the villain, she is an option. Like,
hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and this episode is part of a series called Let's Talk About Labels, where we discuss the labels that we have a love-hate relationship with and break down what they really mean for each of us. Now, as always, we'll also share some ways that you can reflect on how they show up in your own life and career. And for this series, I'm inviting my friends to weigh in and share their experience using one of my very favorite ways to communicate, the voice note. I'm bringing on a co-host for this series as well. She's my friend and fellow entrepreneur, Arden Evenson. She's a content creator who advocates for financial inclusion. And when she's not talking about making money, she's talking about making babies, sharing all about her fertility journey online. In these episodes, we're really going to cover it all, from diving into the depths of human behavior to sharing our, hopefully, hilarious hot takes. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. Okay, welcome back. Hello, Arden.
hi, happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. I'm glad we're both happy about being here. I think that's great.
It is good. It is good. It took us a few times to find a time when we were both going to be happy to be here. Life has been lifing.
Oh my gosh. If that is not so true. We were like, hey, how do you feel about rescheduling? I'd be like, I feel great about rescheduling. And then I would be like, hey, so about today.
I think that's one of the things we realize as adults, right? Like rescheduling is almost always a gift.
It's so true. I honestly I really it always is helpful. And very rarely is there like a deadline or something, where it's like so time critical that it can't be a gift. So I appreciate that. Yes. And these days I'm like, people have stuff going on. People have a lot going on. And we just
Absolutely
have to
something I could do at that time if you give
be
it back
okay
to
with
me.
it.
Like...
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. So not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I'm sure that we can find a way that this is relevant to our topic today,
Sure.
which is the label of being an empath. And this is a really interesting one. I have a lot of empathetic feelings about this. Yeah. No, they're actually not all empathetic, but we'll get into that.
Yeah.
So
it's an interesting one.
Yeah. So, okay. So here's the thing, the definition of an empath. So, the kind of like maybe more colloquial definition of an empath is a person who has a strong ability to understand and share the feelings of others, often feeling others' emotions as if they were their own. And if you go into kind of the more clinical definition of it, so that's an empath is someone who has a heightened sensitivity to the emotional states of others, often absorbing and experiencing those emotions deeply. This can lead to emotional overwhelm and stress, as well as a strong drive to help and support others.
Can confirm.
You're all the labels. We've established that. Every label.
I'm all of the Enneagram numbers and I'm all of the labels. I don't like to miss out.
By the way, I'm not sure if I've said this. I think that makes you an Enneagram type 9, but we'll talk about that another time. When someone is like, I'm all the types, it's like they're probably a 9,
Okay,
which is interesting. Yeah, I mean, and we'll take that offline. Not everybody in the world needs to hear about that part, but I think this is interesting. So having a strong ability to understand the feelings of others versus having a strong ability to share the feelings of others. Like this idea of like, I'm experiencing your emotions. That's the part I have a lot of challenges with. And I can certainly understand someone being really sensitive to the emotions of others, right? And almost to the extent that like they are impacted by it But to say that you can feel other people's emotions, I have questions.
Yeah, and even the word, like, absorb feels really kind of strong there too, right? And I think for me, it's like I definitely feel impacted, right, by other people's emotions. It, like, affects my own emotions.
Yeah.
But yeah, to say that I'm, like, fully experiencing them, I think is very, like puts a lotta puts a lot of confidence in my ability to really know exactly what's going on for that other person.
Yeah, and not just that, it's like, in a way, I don't know, for some reason, like, I kind of feel like it, like, invalidates someone's experience a little bit to be like, "I feel what you feel." Even if
Yeah.
you're not, like, going through the same thing that they're going through, you know? I can see, like, if someone's struggling with something to, like, feel a lot of, like, compassion, like, you being sad makes me feel sad, but, like, I'm not feeling your sadness, I'm feeling my sadness for you, right?
Right. Yeah, it does, like and I think, when I think about my own just, like, engagements with other people's emotions and feelings and stuff, that I often try and come back to this I try and remind myself that I'm making a lot of assumptions usually in
Yeah.
this, like, worrying about other people's feelings and how they might react to things and, like, people pleasing, which you talked about before. Like, I'm making a lot of assumptions about what that other person is feeling and experiencing and assuming and thinking that, like, are not just maybe unhelpful for me, but also potentially unhelpful for them too.
Yeah. Now, I think to not just like totally be a hater, right? I think if you grew up in an environment where, and you've mentioned some things about your childhood in previous episodes, like if you grew up in an environment where it was like almost a survival skill or a protective thing, like it helped you get by in order to like know how everybody else was
Totally.
feeling, being like super sensitive to how people would react to things or how they were coming into a room or coming home or things like that. Like I think I could see how you might be super attuned to how other people feel, right? I mean, it was helpful at some point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even just like the definitions that you shared, it's almost like to me, it's like the first half of both definitions are like feel positive to me. Like we're aware, we're attuned, we're paying attention, we're acknowledging other people's feelings, we're like believing their experience. And then the second half is almost like we've taken it too far. Right?
Yeah.
Like it's not necessary to absorb or to make assumptions or to feel deeply what you think the other person's feeling in order to still have, I think, the benefits of like being an empath. And I will also say like it's not a label that I would ever describe myself as because I do think that it carries a lot of like, I don't know, weight. I feel very sassy about it too. So
I mean, I think yeah, I think just how you and I came into this conversation highlights that, like, this one in particular has maybe not always, like, the most positive of connotations. Not that any of them do, right? Being a perfectionist or a people pleaser, but I think this is one where it gets, like, villainized a little bit more, maybe.
totally. Totally. I'm obsessed with this podcast, Normal Gossip, which takes like an average person sort of everyday gossip stories and like anonymizes it and shares it in, an hour-long episode. And there was definitely one about, I think, a bachelorette party and like the one empath. And that was not the good character, right? Like at the end when they're talking about who's the villain, she is an option. Like
Yeah, yeah.
because of that, I think because like she's labeling herself that she's announcing to the group that she's an empath and there's this like assumption that that makes her better, right? And that like
Mm.
that gives her certain responsibilities or she understands things differently. It's like a hierarchy thing and like I don't feel that when I have empathetic feelings, when I do feel like I get pulled into other people's feelings, I don't feel better about myself. Like, I don't like. I think that again, that feels too far.
Mm.
But I do appreciate, and I do think it's a good skill to generally be empathetic.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Okay, so some of the behaviors in my, Gen AI research to summarize all of the internet. Um, some of the behaviors of an empath are emotional absorption. So an empath might feel deeply affected by the emotions of those around them, experiencing sadness, happiness, stress that mirrors what others are feeling. That's interesting language.
Hmm.
Another thing, they might avoid crowds. So, or avoiding really crowded places or highly emotional environments where they can kind of easily become like overwhelmed by all of these emotions that they feel like they're absorbing. Also deep compassion. I think we, can see how that's something that like all of the suffering and difficulty in the world, like if you're bringing that all in, so often they go out of their way to help others, they offer support and comfort because they can strongly feel others' distress. So it's like they can almost use that to be a martyr, even to say like, well, I feel this so deeply, so I'm gonna like ride for this cause, which I think is an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think I have to work on myself and not, if someone is sharing that they're having a hard time with something or they seem upset, to not jump into like, be like, well, that's an uncomfortable feeling. So let's solve it. Right. Like instead, just like being more comfortable sitting in it, letting them express it, just saying like, that sounds hard.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, we have to fix it. I love fixing things.
Yeah, and I think this will be an interesting one to kind of like, as we listen to the voice notes, to kind of like keep our eyes on that like meter of like, when is this going from like, I feel compassion for someone into like, I absorb that thing or I become that thing, or now it's my responsibility to fix that thing, right? I think there's a fine
Yeah.
line there that's interesting. Yeah, I think the other thing, and then we'll listen to the first voice note, is like, does being an empath get villainized because like we generally as a Western society really suck at validating emotions and talking about our feelings and expressing them, experiencing them, being in them, where it's like highly rewarded and encouraged to like put your feelings in a little box and put them in the back of the closet and get on with your checklist.
Right. Like we love individualism, right? Like, and kind of prioritizing yourself and your needs. And yeah, I think being empathetic, being compassionate is like a really important skill set or aspect of like being in community with people. And I know even as someone that actively wants to be building community, it does feel like I am often up against the sort of like trying to figure out how to do that within the context of this world. It can be difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially because it's bonkers right now and very, very difficult. Okay. Well, let's listen to the first voice note and we'll see what our friends and listeners have to say.
Being an empath has meant that I can fairly easily listen and ask questions to people to understand how they're feeling, and which I enjoy. I like it. I think I'm fed by the energy when it seems like someone might be unloading something they needed to, and I don't find it difficult to allow that and to be the receiver, I guess, of that energy. So it can it can slow me down sometimes in life, but I find more often than not it's positive and creates comfort. It can create relationships possibly easier and create a safe space for people to build relationships in the long run. I think it's shown up positively for me.
Okay. What do you think about that?
That sounds very healthy.
Yeah.
It sounds very healthy. I'm envious.
We support it. Oh, yeah, and wish that you could do that. No.
It sounds not all consuming.
Yes, I think that's the thing. To me, what I heard was I am comfortable being with other people's emotions. I'm comfortable holding
Yeah.
space for like the things that they're feeling and listening and being there with them. And like I think that's great.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any complaints about that one.
No, that sounds great.
I think it is interesting. So, talking about Enneagram types, because just I think in this framework sometimes, but like I've been talking to over the course of, months to a good friend of mine to figure out her Enneagram type. So similar to you, where it's like, okay, well, maybe we're over here, maybe we're over here. And oh, I just heard this thing and like I'm thinking about this for you. And so it's like we're not like having a formal session to figure it out,
Right.
but like it's like an ongoing conversation as our friendship evolves. And so, but today I was just talking to her about a type 4, which the type 4 in the Enneagram is the individualist. It's the high self-expression, um, high value of like authenticity and realness and real like getting into the human experience. And so type 4s in the Enneagram are really good at sitting with people in sadness and dark emotions and difficult times. Like they're like almost love that in a sense of like it's part of the human experience. There's beauty in sadness. And so
Mm.
they're one type that's really great at being empathetic, holding space for people, getting into the depths of the difficult things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm realizing, like, as we're talking about this too, I think for me, like, being an empath or empathy, just like it feels like a responsibility.
Mhm.
And the way that this voice note was talking about it, and even as you described it, it is more this like space that you can step into and like a skill set. But yeah, for me, it feels much more like a thing that I am like supposed to do that's a part of my identity, that I am responsible for bringing into situations.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because as you say that, what I'm kind of thinking about is being empathetic and being an empath are two different things. At least I believe that people see them as two
Totally.
different things, right? And so this
Yeah.
label of being an empath, there's some kind of connotation to it, not that just that I'm an empathetic person, which like I believe I'm an empathetic person. I believe that I can hold space for people and
Yeah.
be with them through great things and difficult things. And I want to hear about their experience and I care about it. Right. And so, but the difference between that and I think I don't identify as an empath is because I don't feel like it consumes me. I don't feel like this burden that I carry that I feel everything for everyone all the time. Like, and maybe, I mean, this is kind of funny because like I'll talk to friends about like shows or movies that, we've both watched and they're like, "Oh my god, did you bawl?" And I was like, "No." Like I do think sometimes I can be like an emotional robot, like in a sense of like I don't feel anything, and I think especially when it comes to like TV characters or movies, like there are some movies where I've cried, but like for the most part, like really awful things happen. Like I love like murder shows and
Yeah.
and like really sad things, and I just will sit there with a straight face and just like consume it as entertainment. So
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's really hard for me to like I'm like thinking of my own like streaming and consumption habits that like I bounce off of shows and movies and stuff really easily and really quickly. And a lot of I may be tying this too much to empathy, but if the situation feels like too fraught or too emotional or too familiar, then like I can't, like I'm like, well, I'm gonna feel the emotions of everything happening, and I don't need that, but that's not the energy I need right now. Like, where's Parks
yeah.
and Rec? Where are the comedies? That's what I
Yeah,
need.
yeah, that's certainly true. Like there are some times where I'm like, I'm not in the mood for that because I don't know where it's gonna like
Uh-huh.
leave me at the end of the show or the movie or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, let's listen to the second one and see what the second person has to say.
Okay, I am going to talk about what it means to be an empath or a highly sensitive person and how it shows up in life, both the strengths and the weaknesses. So even whenever I was a little girl, I have distinct memories of whenever I would see somebody cry, I would have a wave of emotions roll over me and I would start crying, or I would get mad, or I would feel what was going on with every single person around me. And I didn't have the words, I didn't have the understanding for it at that time. But as I moved into adulthood, I was always the person that was listening to people's problems and had a bleeding heart of whatever was going on in their world. I think in the professional world, it helped me in a sense because I can very quickly connect with clients and I can form relationships really easily with people because I think that people almost know that I am feeling what they're feeling. But the problems that come along with that is also anxiety and getting wrapped up in what people are feeling and really trying to resist the urge of wanting everything to be okay. Like if I feel like somebody is sad, I don't want them to be sad anymore. But it's also okay if they're sad. And it's taken me a long time to understand that. So what I really focus on now is coping mechanisms, is understanding that it is a gift, but also that I have to set boundaries and I have to take time to breathe and I have to recognize when I'm getting swept up in other people's emotions and it's okay to take care of myself first.
Okay. Thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to a lot of that, but it's so interesting to hear them talk about like that experience from childhood, right? And like being able to reflect and see that because I that's such a, I don't know, it's such a tangible example of that while I'm aware of that for me as a kid, I don't remember it being that clearly. And I was definitely the kid that was like making fun of my mom for crying at movies growing up. So I certainly had the opposite of it at that point.
Yeah, so she brought up a term, an HSP, a highly sensitive person, and I've heard this term before. And I do think, I mean, it is like I think it's a psychology term. And so, you know, if this thing exists, then yes, there are people that are highly sensitive to other people's emotions. And the fact that, like, as a child, you can kind of just like immediately like respond to it. It's like, I believe that this is a thing, right? Like, I also like in the work that I do really recognize that like we all have very different gifts and like, okay, this is not mine. It's not a label that I get or I associate with, identify myself with. And that doesn't mean I don't believe that other people, you know, have it. I
Right.
know I have like a little like spicy take on this, but it's like interesting because, you know, it's like this immediate reaction to other people's emotions. And to me, there's almost like a little bit of like, you know, we talk about neurodivergence, right? Sometimes where it's like, we're all just built differently. Like our systems are built differently.
Yeah, and I've done a little bit of light reading around like highly sensitive people. So I feel like I'm on kind of that spectrum, and for whatever reason that label, that definition feels nicer. But yeah, it is its own like it feels like sometimes that just it's almost just like the sensitivity or the empathy is like taking up too big of a part of my brain. And I'm thinking about this very specific example. I'm like with my friend in the park, we're outside, we're both pretty loud, and these women were clearly upset about how loud we were. And like we're like commented on it. And we're like, okay, we're loud. Like but like we're outside, like, and like at a park. And I basically was like done for the rest of the conversation. I think we were there for 30 or 45 minutes. And I was so upset that I'd like upset these women and that we'd been so loud and we were disrupting their time. And then later on, I noticed one of the women was like crying. And I was like, this has nothing to do with me. Like, right? Like,
Yeah.
this was just a hard day for her. I'm sorry that she's having a hard day. I don't need to like fix it or worry about what I did. But
Yeah.
that was one of those moments where I was like, God, this part of my brain feels bigger than it needs to be because like we got quieter. They said we were too loud, so we modulated our volume a little bit. Everyone moved on except this brain, and this brain could not let it go, and is still thinking about it months later.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it almost sounds like the like people pleaser conversation
Totally.
of you were upset because you upset someone else, right? Like you didn't want to have upset somebody.
Yes.
And so that to me is like you're not feeling her feelings. You are feeling your own feelings about her feelings,
Oh my
right?
god.
Like-
I think that's a great point.
But this idea of like, I could be happy and then see someone crying and immediately start crying. I mean, I do know people like that. And I believe that that's just like again, it can be a gift. It's not generally like celebrated in our society. And how I think what I loved about this last voice note was like, how do I cope? How do I carry this gift responsibly where it's not causing me to be like, I feel your sadness. I don't like feeling sadness. So I'm going to fix your sadness so that I don't
Uh-huh.
have to
Yeah.
be sad.
Problem solved.
Right? Like, yeah, exactly. It's like you have to let people be in their own sadness. Now, if you are feeling it too, how can you create boundaries? How can you like what's your like plan in the moment? And then what's your maintenance plan for being able to kind of regulate your own emotions over time, every day? What do you do? What's your practice? Like whether it's dumping out whatever it is that you absorbed from the day before you go to sleep, or finding ways to like pause. And I think she even said, like, take a breath, like take a beat. Like, this is not my problem to solve. I feel this thing, and like it's not my responsibility to fix it in this person because they also maybe feel fine about it, you know?
Yeah, I also she started talking about the role this plays sort of in work, right? And I feel like, over the last 4 years, especially, like empathy when it comes to being a manager is like such a buzzword. And it's like, how do you teach empathy? How do you encourage empathy? That's like the real key to like management. I'm not saying that it's true. That is the real key, but certainly that's what people are talking about.
Yeah.
And so I think interesting. So that's sort of the first place I feel like I go when I think about like what are the benefits to being sort of a more sensitive person, is that kind of management role. Though I think in my case, it made management difficult because I wanted to solve all of the problems for the people that I was managing. I didn't want them to feel bad. I wanted to shield them. And there's a role for like managers to protect the people that are reporting to them, but never letting them solve their own problems or come to you with what their solutions are or what's really bothering them, and just making assumptions and trying to make a soft little bubble around them is like not the solution for like long-term growth success for that individual either. And so I liked also that she talked about like building relationships with clients. I think for me, it's also, a lot of my work is in communications and writing, and it makes my writing better because I do feel like I'm able to put myself in other people's sort of shoes and situations and think about what they're feeling, even if I haven't been in that situation.
Yeah, totally. I think that's again, it's kind of this distinction between being an empathetic person,
Right.
being able to not experience but understand how someone else feels or maybe what their perspective is or that kind of thing, versus like becoming it and merging with it. I do think like again, there are people that have this really unique gift, and what do we do with it? Like how do we like leverage that? I mean, things like, I don't know, being an actor would be like a great, like
Yeah.
that'd be a great way to leverage this like sensitivity that you have to other emotions and like just make you better at your craft, right?
I think about it too in the context of like being a therapist, right? That
Mm.
like in some ways it would be this incredible skill, right? To be able to like read and understand people. But like I've even told my therapist, I was like, I couldn't do your job. This would overwhelm me. Like, I don't think that I could like put this experience into put that into a box and kind of move on from my day and have 9 of these conversations every day that are so heavy and then be like, all right, going home, the other day at the office.
Yeah, I think you'd have to have a very solid toolkit of coping skills if you are a therapist that considers themselves a highly sensitive
Yeah.
person or an empath, because that's just a lot to take on, right? But I could see how like being a deeply feeling person translates into amazing art, right?
Yeah,
Acting,
totally.
other forms of art, like all of that stuff, like
Definitely.
poetry, like all of these things, right? I think probably a lot of poets and painters and people like that might experience a lot of
Right.
other people's emotions and translate it into their work.
Yeah.
Okay, let's listen to the third and final one.
I think the label of empath is really about being sensitive, observant, and probably intuitive. So, how that shows up for me in my life is when I'm speaking with someone, I'm taking into account their tone, their facial expressions, their body language, and reading between the lines to see if what they're saying is aligning to all of these nonverbal cues. And depending on who the person is, I'm able to like dive deeper and say, hey, what's really going on, or not. But yeah, that's what it means to me.
Yeah, I like the word intuitive,
Yeah,
bringing
same.
that into this conversation, right? Where it's like, I think, I actually don't know, like, technically how is intuitive defined? Because I think intuitive can be used in a couple different ways. One is, I just know, like, I'm intuitive and I know exactly what you're thinking right now. Or it's like, I'm intuitive and then I pick up on all of the little more subtle things in order to kind of create the picture, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's like the way that she described it too. I'm like, I want everyone to have those skills, right? That like I
Right.
think if we think about the like I don't know, the big label of empath, it's like not everyone necessarily I think fits under that sort of like umbrella or that definition, but like that like observant, intuitive, sensitive, like I think we all benefit if we have a little bit of that in our like interactions as we move through the world.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's reading the room, it's reading people or being observant of people, right? I don't think
Yeah.
that like say you're more built on a system that's like rational thinking and more scientific and engineering mind, right? And like maybe not as attuned to emotions. And so that's fine. And you can still develop this skill set of let me be observant of the body language. Let me like listen to the words that this person is using and consider how they might be showing up differently today than yesterday. And like maybe they're having a hard day. Like, can I start to put the pieces together to kind of like respect and acknowledge where they might be emotionally?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a lot of what I heard, you know, in her. Like, I do think that some people naturally do that more easily than others, but it's a skill set that you can develop, right?
Definitely. I mean, I think that's whenever I have like a hard kind of career conversation in particular, whether it's like a weird meeting with a client or talking to someone I'm working with something, and I'm like, that didn't feel good. Like my kind of first intellectual question myself is like, what are they feeling insecure about or what are they worried about? And if I can like maybe figure that out, then I can sort of start to place kind of the behavior and emotions and also think about from a working relationship, where is it best for me to like plug in related to that particular concern as opposed to like spiraling and being like, well, they're mad at me. They're like, they don't like how this project is going. They don't want to work with me anymore. It's just like, oh no, there's like probably this one thing that's bothering them. And how can I make them feel more comfortable about that really specific aspect of the work?
Yeah. I think this is veering away a little bit from true like technical empathy, but
Yeah.
in like my coaching training, I've had similar kind of advice or guidance of like a big part of like or part of coaching that people like don't really think about is like, am I present with like what's going on in my own body? Like, am I attuned to like this feeling, this gut feeling? Or even once I had one of my teachers say, like, do you feel like dissatisfied at the end of a session? Because if you do, like maybe that's something to acknowledge and think about, like, did you go deep enough? Did you ask
Mm,
questions that like help that person make the connections? Like if I don't feel satisfied at the end of a session, maybe there's like, of course it's an inquiry, right? Because it's like it's not, the session isn't about me. And can I use that as an indicator to say maybe we didn't really get as honest as I would have liked us to?
right. It's still a good data point.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
paying attention to what's going on in you, right? And like those intuitions even to say how am I using this in service of like showing up for someone else or holding space for someone else or asking them how they're doing when like I get like a weird feeling from them, you know?
Yeah. Well, it feels like it comes back to this idea of like, we're not just like different individuals moving in isolation, right? Like we're overlapping and engaging with each other in different ways, and everyone's not sort of like living in their own vacuum, feeling kind of feelings independently, even if they are unique to them and like we aren't going to fully absorb them or reflect them, like there's still overlap.
Yeah. So, as we wrap up this episode, I'm curious if you have any kind of like resources or tools or prompts or like what does this make you think of? And I think one thing for me, again, I think I've mentioned this book in like half of my episodes. Like Emotional Agility, I think is a really amazing book. It's by an author, Susan David, and she talks about the chemical process of experiencing an emotion, right? And then after that like chemical process happens as humans, right? Not to say like everybody needs to like stop at 90 seconds of experiencing an emotion and never have anything else, right? It's and then it's like, what stories do we attach to it? What thoughts do we attach to it? What feelings do I have about that emotion that I just experienced? So it's like separating that emotion, the chemical process from all the meaning that we make out of it. And I think for me, that feels like a good resource in terms of like building your skills around emotional regulation. Like, and how do I separate my stuff from your stuff? So I think maybe another thing I would say is like, a set of questions. Am I feeling this person's sadness or am I feeling sad because they feel sad? You know, it's like
Yeah.
finding ways to separate. Am I feeling like, is this person uncomfortable or am I uncomfortable with what they're telling me or experiencing? You know, and
Yeah.
so is this mine or is this yours? And like, how do I start to like question that in myself, you know?
Yeah. The thing that it makes me think of is, I mean, I feel like I'm, all of these conversations are like I'm on my own journey to figure out my own coping skills and boundaries. I do think that I mean, even just having this conversation and talking through voice notes, I do think that like you sort of like hit the nail on the head of like I'm an empathetic people pleaser, right? Like there's a level of empathy and like highly sensitive person in there, but I do think the like root of so much of my drive around other people's emotions is like my own discomfort. Like willing to admit that. One of the voice notes reminded me a little bit of I did a little bit of EMDR therapy, and one of the things that we do in that is this idea of a container. And so you essentially in your mind build like a container. And so mine looked almost like I don't know, like a treasure chest or something. And you think about exactly how you close it and lock it up. You kind of feel yourself sort of bringing that lid down and putting things in it. And so it's not that you are ignoring feelings or, never going to touch them again, but it's when it's not the time maybe to be feeling those deep feelings or they're not going to serve you or someone else, then it's like thinking through this like having your container in your mind and like opening up and like putting these things from your brain in there and then watching yourself really like close it and secure it and kind of put it away. And I think that that's something that has been helpful to me in some ways, and there's probably applications of it here too.
Yeah, I think a visualization is like always a really good, helpful tool. And I think especially like if you are someone who identifies as an empath, I can like almost picture you going throughout your day like you're collecting everyone's baggage, right? And it's like,
Totally.
okay, I'm feeling this, and this person was like having a stressed out day, and so I picked up their anxiety, and this person's, and it's like you're just like picked up all this stuff throughout the day. And whether it's like a physical practice or like a visualization, like a mental practice of like, at the end of the day, can you like bathe yourself in like a white light and like let all that stuff go? Or even just like get in the shower, like actually, right? And like visualize yourself like washing off all the other people's stuff that you picked up from the
Yeah.
day. I think those types of things, like as much as, I'm sure there are skeptics out there that are like, okay, well, I'm just going to imagine myself like letting this stuff go. But I think there's a lot of science behind visualizations, right? And just like having an emotional regulation practice that can fit in that bucket of having a practice to regulate your emotions by just like imagining yourself kind of like letting it all go or washing it all away. And so I think that's like something that people could consider.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so we're gonna leave this one here. I think I got more empathetic from the beginning to the end of the episode. I do believe that people absorb other people's emotions, and I think that maybe this is one of those terms that gets overused
Yeah.
when we're not drawing that distinction of, is this mine or is this yours? And I'm having a lot of feelings about your feelings, and is that being an empath or is that taking on other people's emotions? So
Right. And I think just because we have empathy and like have the skill set of being empathetic, I don't think necessarily puts us into that kind of category or identity or label of being an empath.
yeah. Okay. Good things to reflect on.
Yeah.
And until next time, where we talk about a new label.
Till next time.